Hello, everyone. I'm going to wait for just a couple of moments here where people are able to join us. But for those of you that are already part of the session here, my name is Don McIntyre. I'm design director at the Innovation School at the Glasgow School of Art. And this is Expo North's Story and Design Series 2, Design and the Customer Experience. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Ximena O'Reilly. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. So far,
Perfect.
so good, Ximena, which is a combination of a couple of different types of names there, who is Global Head of Design for Nestlé. So to have Ximena here speaking to us today is a real privilege and a real opportunity for us to find out all about what Nestlé do, how she operates in that position, how Nestlé approach design, and hopefully provide some insight and information to people who may be considering a career in design and branding and packaging and all those kind of things. So welcome, Ximena, first of all. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so when you and I caught up the other day and we decided on a few themes to talk through today. And the first of those themes was really all about you. So can you tell us a wee bit? I've obviously done some LinkedIn trolling in terms of your background, Ximena, but could you tell us just how you got to where you are just now in terms of your career?
Sure. So thank you, Don. Thank you, Expo North, for inviting me. Yeah, you start with the part that I'm probably the least comfortable talking about myself, but here goes. Let me give you a little bit of context. I may sound a little American. That's because I am of English and Irish background, but I was forced to move by my family to California when I was 13. So the last thing I wanted to do was stick out. So I got rid of the English accent. But that's not what you're interested in. What you may be interested in is how did I get to Nestle and how do I get to work in design? And I have to say, I'm in my 50s. So when I look at the courses, that obviously, Don, you have at your university today or other universities around the world in the area of design, I think if that had been on offer to me, I would have just, leapt into one of those degree programs. When I was growing up, I'd always been an artist, so I'd always studied art, drawn, doodled everywhere. But I had quite an academic family in the sense of, go and do something academic, and then you can always sort of, find a way to do your art. And I did that. And my first job outside of university, and let me backtrack a little bit. I went to university and I studied East Asian studies. And one of the reasons I did that is that I really fell in love with the Japanese language, which I had the opportunity to start to learn when I was a teenager. And I spent time in Japan. And I was always interested in Japanese literature, Japanese art, and even just the little cultural nuances, going into a shop and, seeing how they pay attention to, the loveliest and tiniest of details. So anyway, so after I finished my degree, I started in a publishing company. And I think one of the reasons why I was interested in the publishing side was I probably got the job because of my writing skills and research skills. But as soon as I was in the job, I was volunteering for page layout and, can I just do the cover and, and those sorts of things. And so there was really a mixture of sort of an academic foundation, but coupled with hands-on development of tools, of learning the Mac, learning the whole Adobe suite. Back then it was Quark Express for page layout.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then I transitioned to working at design agencies. And I think that interested me a little bit more than the publishing side. Then I went back to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school, I got approached by Landor, which is a big branding consultancy. but I didn't really know it at the time. I just thought it was a design agency. But that sort of opened my eyes to this whole area of branding. And that's where I started to realize that I really liked the connection of being able to visually communicate, whether it's a brand or something else, but understanding a sense of place, people, culture, history, so, sort of my academic foundation being woven into, well, how could we, within a logo, communicate, and especially if it's a logo for a bank in another country, or something like that. So that's why I really shifted away from any conceptions of, staying in academia or being a writer, to saying, you know what, I really like the power of visual communications. I like this area of branding, and that's pretty much stuck, so I stayed on the agency side for a while. And then I had a little foray on working for one of my clients, which was a startup, and that was super interesting to go to a startup, and the craziness that can ensue there, and all the hats that you have to wear. And then I went back agency side, and then finally I went client side, first to what has now become Mondelez, but which was Kraft Foods when I joined them, and then I joined Nestlé in 2013. So,
gosh, it's certainly a thorough journey. So in all those experiences that you've had, and roles that you've had, if you think on a day-to-day basis in terms of what you do now, which of those experiences and which of those skills that you've learned, that you probably something didn't even realize you were learning at the time, do you? When you bring them to bear later on in your career, which of those do you think are you most thankful of? Which of those do you think, gosh, I learned this at this particular point in my career, that you think, I'm glad that I did, because I'm able to use that now?
Okay, I'm gonna probably say something that I probably shouldn't say. I've got teenage sons, so maybe I don't want them to hear this, but I was a little bit of a slacker in my early 20s. I was kind of hopping job to job. I was, different agencies, and partly that was circumstantial because of the economy at the time.
Yeah.
I was trying different things. I had friends who were kind of, going in more sort of traditional professions, and I'm super thankful that I did that, because I got to see lots of different ways of working, different environments. I learned a lot of things. Sometimes I went into a role and, had to very quickly learn either a new industry, so, how do you do branding or design for telecommunications, or, I remember actually I was at Interbrand when we got the brief for what became Wi-Fi, but it was
Really?
like this
Wow.
telecommunications
Wow.
consortium that wanted to brand
Yeah.
this code, right? And so those sorts of things, I think, like, the fact that I tried lots of different things, that I was unafraid to kind of, if I didn't like something, to go and be freelance for a while and then try something else. I think that was helpful. I'm really grateful that at times when I really just needed the money, frankly, I, took on, projects which were very production heavy. I had to get into kind of like, how do you build mechanicals, like those sorts of things, because I have a foundation of understanding what it takes to get things done. I also, when I was working at the .com, it was early days of an e-commerce platform, but I had to quickly learn, and be part of, how do we build wireframes? How do we think about the whole, e-commerce side? How do we, do deals, with other platforms, et cetera? So I'm super grateful that I had exposure to that in my earlier career, because even though, of course, I haven't been able to keep up with many of those skills, I have the foundation, which I think has definitely helped me empathize, if not sort of understand better, some of what it takes to get design done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think I empathize very much with that. The thing that makes sometimes art school and design school appealing to people is this divergent thought process, the sense of exploration and using design artifacts to find out more about a particular problem. What you're speaking about there is that convergent process of distilling down that insight into hard ideas, facts, and output, which isn't always pretty, but is absolutely necessary. And I think what you're saying there is, by moving between these different roles, you've almost accumulated a portfolio of skills and experience that is rare, really, but it takes a little bit of time to build it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. I think I was probably in my mid 30s when I started to realize, wow, I do feel very confident
Yes.
in knowing what I know. But I think, in my 20s, I wouldn't have said the same thing. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I didn't know that there was really a career path in design. I
Yes.
mean, I wasn't a traditional, illustrator. I wasn't a traditional, packaging designer. I
Yeah.
wasn't a salesperson. Sometimes I contributed to that, but I wasn't very comfortable in that sort of business development role.
Yes,
So
but
yeah,
that also allows you to be that allows you to be a very efficient translator of need, doesn't it?
yeah,
And the almost the acting as a Tower of Babel between all those disciplines that allows you to be multilingual in terms of what needs to be passed between those disciplines.
yeah.
And we'll maybe come to that in a wee bit. In terms of Nestle, what made you join? What was the reason that you joined? Presumably, you could have done a whole bunch of things at the time that you did. What was the thought process that you went through before and in making that decision?
Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I was already in Switzerland, and I think that's important because I had I had lived in Switzerland a little bit as a child, and then we'd moved away and eventually to the US. And I moved back to Switzerland in mid 2000s, and so I had sort of already been aware for a while. Of what Nestle does. I think a lot of people don't really know what Nestle does and how many brands there are behind the Nestle brand. Um, and I think I had always felt that if you're going to try to make an impact, you can do it in any number of ways. You can do it as an individual level. You can do it in an NGO. Um, and you can do it on the big company side. And I really felt that Nestle, at the time that they were speaking to me, were committed to moving this huge ship in a direction which was very positive. So it was a leap of faith, to be quite honest, and I'm really glad that I jumped on board, because there has been a period of quite some change, and there's still going to be a lot of change, and there's still a lot more work to be done.
Yeah.
But that I would say that is one of the reasons. I was already in Switzerland. I knew the power of what Nestle, what its potential was, and I wasn't really afraid of kind of coming into this big corporate behemoth. And I think that, quite frankly, having worked with big companies on the agency side, and then having had that stepping stone where for 4 years I was at Kraft Foods, it allowed me to, make that judgment call of, okay, do I want to continue and stay on the big, the big corporate side?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I felt like it was the right time in my career to do that.
Okay. And for those, and I was one of these people, I was embarrassed that I didn't really know enough about Nestle. It was really in advance of this conversation with you that I did some digging, and the numbers are eye-watering. And these are probably slightly outdated, so please correct me. 328,000 employees in over 150 countries. Could be more than that now, I suspect. 418 factories in over 185 countries, 40 R&D centres, over 2,000 brands. And this is the one, and again, we caught up prior to the call. It is difficult to picture these numbers. 1 billion Nestle products are sold every day. So I had all these questions I was going to ask you with respect to how do you manage brand, but this is this overarching organisation which looks after a number of different brands, and all of those have movers and drivers. But within the confines of Nestle, are there other specific? Well, what are the brand values that you need to address, or you look at addressing with design and design values? Are there those things? And what is the process, if any, in terms of distilling those down to the individual brands? And do they make it? Is it possible to do that? Is it possible with an organisation that large to distill down these overarching brand values, or even organisational values, into something that makes sense on a leaf level?
Yeah, it's not easy. But let me take you through a little bit of the journey that we've been on, and I'll talk about sort of what we call brand building, the
Sure.
Nestle way, which is, how do you establish the strategic framework for the brand, and then how do you ensure that that cascades, to all of the markets,
Perfect. Great.
as well as I'll talk to you a little bit about how we've approached brand identity and design. When I joined, it was a little bit of the heritage of kind of where Nestle had come from, where of course it was born in Switzerland and it grew in Switzerland, but the majority of the growth was outside of Switzerland. And I think if you looked back at Nestle, dozens of years ago, there were lots of different Nestles, so lots of different, configurations around the world. Sometimes a lot of local brands, not just focus on, some of the more global brands. And since I've joined, there's been much more consideration placed in terms of which brands are going to be managed globally, which ones are going to be managed globally, but executed locally, and which brands are going to be really, in the domain of the local markets, because they are local brands, and the marketers and the business people in those markets know their consumers best. So there's been a lot of governance and thinking about, who really should be involved in some of the decisions on the brand, and also where should the work on those brands be done. So that's been helpful, to be sort of able to, leverage that. Now, that having been said, what I also found coming in was design, and I would say even to this day, we're still struggling with the definition of design. But, when you said design, people would sort of automatically go to packaging design.
Yeah.
And in the context of packaging design, I also felt that there really wasn't this understanding of what was your brand identity versus what was your packaging expression. And that also comes out of, I would say, a legacy of having seen the package, especially, of course, years ago before digital, as the primary way that you convey your message, who you are to consumers, what the product is inside. And thus, that was the place where most of the design efforts were placed. And you can see, if you look at some of our logos, it kind of struck me that the logos didn't really have extractable units. Like, think about like how you're going to take one of our logos and put it onto, Instagram, because it would be kind of like this floating thing that needed like a color background, and maybe it was sort of anchored to something else. And that really comes from this legacy of having designed identity through the lens of packaging. So I had to kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, how can we ensure that we approach brand identity first and then think about the packaging expression? And so that meant, making sure we were anchoring on the brand strategy. So brand strategy first, which in our world is sort of our brand essence, what are all of those, values, as you were mentioning, who's our target, what's our purpose, and we're woven into that is even what's the sustainability promise, Then from that, we developed some ways of trying to address brand identity. And why I'm hesitating or pausing here is just to say brand strategy is great, and I love brand strategy, but it's words on paper. And so when you think of the number of markets that we work with, and even if English is the common language, the level of English may not be the same everywhere. And so if you provide a document with words to different markets, they might interpret it differently. So trying to find a conversation, around, whether a logo or a color or a shape, a texture, a pattern was right for a brand, and you really only have the brand essence, as good as it may be, to kind of be your reference, was not substantial enough. So we developed something called the 5 senses, which was my sort of way of saying, look, if we have this foundation, we know kind of what we want to be, but how do we want people to feel? So when they come across a brand, a product, an Instagram post, how do we want them to feel? When they dig into that Kit Kat, how do we want them to feel? And so we kind of artificially took apart each of the five senses. I know there are more senses than five, but the primary five senses, and started to work with our teams to try to figure out, okay, well, how do you want people, to feel when they see you, when they smell you, when they taste you, when they touch you, when they hear you? Yeah. And that was, I think, one of the first times when we started to connect the dots between different functions. So how could we draw in the product developers, the packaging developers, the technical packaging developers, the marketers, of course, the insights people, the salespeople, and really look at that through a lens of, okay, how do we want people to feel in the future? And we end up with kind of the more traditional sort of mood boards, expressions of that. Sometimes we create a sort of an inspirational internal video, to help express that. But that helped with the springboard between, okay, we know what our strategy is, brand strategy. Now we kind of know how we want people to feel. Now we can look back more objectively at our logos, our colors, all of the tools that we have within our brand identity to see whether or not they're sufficient, whether or not they're still relevant. And of course, we pair that with research. What do we actually know in terms of resonance, recollection, recognition, and all that. But that helps us make more informed choices with regards to, what are we going to do about our brand identity? We then build action plans, because of course you can't address everything all at once. It might take years. We prioritize, and then we start the design briefs. Right. And those design briefs could be a sonic identity. It could be a brand identity. We need to do some really major overhauls, or it could be, maybe some light retouches, but now we really need to address our packaging expression. Yeah. And that becomes easier because then we've got sort of some things aligned, and alignment is super key. So we align the brand strategy, we align the five senses, we align the brand identity, or at least the action plan. And then we can kind of, start to carve it up. And the reason why we have to do that is if you think of some of our global brands, we absolutely need to involve, some of the key local markets. We have to, make sure that we are doing an audit of what's happening in those, different competitive sets. And, sometimes it's quite of a slow process, but we hope that means that what we do is going to be much more long-term, because changing any part of our brand identity and packaging expression is really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ximena, talk to me a little bit about the five senses aspect, if we can dive into that in a little bit more detail. Was that something so you as a creative in your role, is that something was that the long hunch for you? Did you have a sense that there needed to be some form of design artifact that could be used as a mechanism of improving that process? Was it a combination of a number of things perhaps you'd experienced before? And then in terms of convincing, and it probably was a convincing job that you had to do, your wider team around the efficacy of this tool, how did that work? How did you introduce that mechanism into the design department or the marketing department?
So I would say I probably introduced it because my first attempt failed.
Right.
So, I think it was in my first year, I was asked to lead a discussion on the brand's properties, or, the component parts of a brand identity for one of our global brands. And so I pulled in, I was guided in terms of who the key stakeholders would be. And what I realized was, we didn't have great representation from all parts of the functional areas, so there was marketing showed up, and some more sort of general business people showed up. But what I found was that there really wasn't the vocabulary to describe what was right or wrong with the brand identity. So of course we did audits, and we had a room back then, we could actually get together physically. So we had like a room of like pictures of like, what good looked like, what bad looked like, and all that. But it was a very subjective discussion, and the creatives in the room I felt that they were being dominated by sort of business logic. And that's okay, except that we weren't getting to some of the real unlocking truths about what we could or should be doing. So that was sort of, that failure, or it wasn't a total failure, but it didn't go very well. It was a difficult discussion, made me realize not only do we have a long way to go at Nestlé to try to introduce a way of thinking about just sort of perception and design, and also how do we respect design professionals, creative professionals, and give them a space, to say things, even if it isn't in their own best interest, because maybe they developed, some of those elements, and we've got to look at it a little bit critically sometimes. So that was it. I think also, I don't know, I mean, for many years I had been really interested in the sensory dimensions. I think when you work in food, you're so aware of the fact that if you don't pay attention to even, how the photography of the product on the front of pack, is done, no matter how good your design, that sort of sensory dimension could completely let you down, especially if it's one thing if it sort of exudes, some sort of reaction. It's another if it actually just doesn't even correspond to the product experience, right? So I think a hunch is the right word. I also think I was given, some opportunities to work with some local brands in the market. And one of my first ports of call was in Brazil. And I was super fortunate to have a great team there who were really up for, whatever you want to do, experiment, we'll be the pilot. So I took them up on that. And, we did a couple of different 5 senses. Back then, actually, what we did is we holed up for 2 weeks in an agency. So we were fortunate enough to be kind of given this very creative space. And we brought the Nestlé people there. We were surrounded by creatives. I brought creatives from London to mix with creatives from Sao Paulo so that we could really be thinking differently. We had advertising and digital agencies present too, so we really could be thinking about the full spectrum of how the multisensory experience of, in this case, it was 2 different brands, should come to life. And what we did, we did something which we don't typically do, is that we sort of developed that vision of how we wanted the 5 senses to be for each of the brands. And then we went really quickly to rapid prototyping to see what could be the impact of that. And then we sort of backwards engineered the action plan of what we were going to do. In some cases, we still do that. But in most cases now, what we do is we sort of pause after we've come up with that vision of what the 5 senses should look like, correspond with, etc. We get some alignment, and then we go into the briefing stage.
Amazing. So perfect. You're kind of torpedoing my questions as you're doing your explanation here, Ximena. So my question was going to be, and perhaps it's still worth asking actually, and that is to do with the vast array of international regions that you're working across, and secondly, the bringing together of teams within it. That's such a large creative environment, not just a creative environment, large environment who need to work together. So is the 5 senses mechanism something you find is helpful in galvanizing those teams across those territories? And then I suppose an extension to that, do you then, presumably there's a need to evaluate the extent to which that tool is still being effective, while leaving it as just something you take off the shelf? Presumably there's some kind of retrospective analysis in terms of, to what extent is that still valid? Is it still working across these territories? Is that something which is programmed into the structure of the design within Nestlé, or is it more ad hoc than that?
So it's a great question, because I would answer it differently if you'd asked me that a year ago, because you're right that it was a little bit of a discretionary tool, and what we were finding was that some of the bigger brands, whether they were local or global, were doing it. Some were sort of postponing doing it. Now what we've done is we've actually made it mandatory for certain brands to do, not, yeah, so all of the brands, of course, need to do their brand essence, so their strategy foundations, but now, you know, they also need to do their 5 senses. They've also got to define their brand identity. And we have a mechanism for documenting that, and we're transitioning from a mechanism which was more sort of PDF based to digital. But yeah, that's sort of work in progress. But we have found, so some of the early 5 senses we have updated, you know, so that's because, you know, they need to reflect strategy, and some of our brand strategies have evolved, you know, so, you know, we there, it's almost like this domino effect, right? You know, if you go back and we change something that's foundational, we need to make sure that the foundations of the house are still in place, you know, next level up are the 5 senses, and looking at the brand identity, and then looking at, you know, both the product experience side as well as the communication side.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I've heard mentioned by someone else who works for, I think it was, let me get the gentleman's name here, who talked about Mark Schneider. I think he's still involved in the organization. He's
our CEO.
CEO, yeah. Well, I hoped he still was, because he certainly was when I watched his clip on YouTube. He talked about the educated consumer, and how in recent years the consumer is more aware about the products that he or she are purchasing and engaging with, and the values that they might have on a number of different levels. So presumably that's something which your department must be acutely aware of, is the consciousness of the consumer in terms of their engagement with the brand, and their awareness of what that brand and brand story might mean. Is that sentience, if that's the right term, on behalf of the consumer? Have you noticed a difference in that in recent years?
No, absolutely. I mean, especially in the food and beverage space, you know, our competitive set has completely transformed, you know, so, and, you know, there are some great new smaller brands, you know, that are really, really leveraging power of design, not just on their packs, but, you know, in every contact point. So I've loved that, because it's a great challenge to us. And I would say, you know, the one place that my team has been playing an instrumental role is not only in trying to figure out the how do you translate brand strategy, you know, to brand identity, and ultimately that, of course, will extend to the packaging expression, where it's more focused. I think in the past Nestlé was sort of more focused in front of pack, or, you know, the consumer facing panels, you know, how are they communicating? The back of pack, quite frankly, it was sort of a compliance land, you know. There was a lot of.
By back of pack, do you mean literally the metric type information that's in the back of a piece of packaging?
Yeah, I'm talking about like any other secondary panels, you know, that, you know, in some cases those were really well done. There was like nice marketing tags, there might be some nice visuals on how to use the product, but really it was, I mean, I think I can be quite critical of many of our back of packs. It was sort of, you know, left to every different contributor adding a different element, you know, and we had some rules, you know, but it was not pretty. Yeah. There was just a lot of different information, right? So what we've done, and you know, and you couple with that the fact that we have, you know, some amazing commitments, you know, that we've made with regards to changing the packaging, the material, making sure that all of our packaging, you know, by 2025 is either reusable or recyclable. And of course, we are doing a lot with regards to, you know, who we're working with, the communities we work with, you know, and also, you know, the products themselves, you know, what's inside the products. And people want to know that stuff, you know, they don't want to have to hunt around, you know, on a pack. And so, we drew great inspiration from, others who are doing this much better than us to say, look, we have to have a big rethink. We started that project a couple of years ago, and, at Nestle, things do take a while, and something of that level of impact needs to go to our executive board, which it did a few times. And now, we're in the implementation stage of a program that we call the Backstory. And we named it the Backstory. We actually wanted, we kind of wanted to use sort of the marketing, the internal marketing of an initiative like this, because we wanted to highlight the importance of it. Because as a marketer, you have so much to do if you're in a market, that the last thing you might pay attention to is, oh yeah, and I've got to deal with, all those other secondary panels. And what we wanted to heighten was, what, that is just as critical as your front of pack. A consumer today, whether they're online or they're in a store, they're going to be checking everything.
I was just going to say that the inclination for the consumer, perhaps it would be really interesting to almost see the CCTV footage over the last 50 years of how people pick up a product, and if whether or not now there's a greater inclination to turn it over and see whether or not it's got everything in Scotland has like a 90% sugar content at the best of times, but whether or not that is something which the consumers would do now.
Well, I mean, and there's all kinds of, things that people are looking for. I just myself, I have a son who's vegetarian, so I gotta check, that. Yep. I've got a husband who's got a food allergy, I got to check that. Personally, I might care about, the sourcing of, certain ingredients, etc. So everybody has different reasons for wanting to see information, and we weren't making it easy. So with the Backstory, what we've done is, and this is just starting to come out. So most of our packs are still on the old system, but really making sure that we have a place where we do what we call brands with purpose storytelling. So our brands are doing, some great things, mostly behind the scenes. So what is the backstory of the actions that the brands are taking? And then the rest of the information, how can we organize it and display it in a way that's much more intuitive, and it may not be, one size fits all, meaning that, some packs and some products, it might be much more important to understand, how you use it. So the priority of communication of that information, needs to be, different than one where it's a instant consumption and you need to know, how do I dispose of, or etc.
It reminds me a little bit back in for those of us old enough to remember when LPs were a thing, and picking up an LP and turning it over to see who was playing on the LP, as opposed to just knowing what the song title was and associating a way of feeling with that song. There's a need now to understand who's in the band and who they are, and that has a bearing on the extent to which that'll sound good and feel good. So in terms of working in these other territories, I'm right in saying that you engage a lot with agencies, design agencies within those territories, right? So presumably a lot of what you and your team must be doing is that translation piece, that communication piece between all those elements you're speaking about just now, these tools and approaches, and crossing the divide. And there often is a divide, I think, in terms of taking those values and insight and making it meaningful at a point of execution. So is that something that you have codified, the Nestlé? Is that do you have a particular way of working with agencies, or again, is it something that you do on ground at the coalface?
Yeah, so it's work in progress. About 5 years ago, there was a massive overhaul in terms of how we approach what we call innovation and renovation. And that was end to end. And it was also looking at all of the different functions involved, so everything from like, how do you start with, the consumer insights that might lead you to an opportunity area, to thinking about what you might do, all the way through to, how do you get the products, to a shop. Now, within that, I think I had both the luxury and maybe the curse of having it being identified that packaging development in particular was a huge bottleneck. And right. So that led to us being given quite a lot of room to rethink that whole area. And that's led to something that we call design to delivery. And that is both a process, and I think it's really important that we really mapped the whole process. And we did that. And we're a huge company, right? But we can't, have everybody collaborate. But what we did do is I think we had 30 different markets represented. And then, at some stage we brought ourselves all together, for a couple of weeks, and we really mapped out, there were some great, I'll go back and say there were some real pockets of best practice at Nestlé. And and really where we were doing design well, and packaging design in particular, was where we had in-house studios. So we do have, we mostly work with design agencies, but we do have, some big, centers of excellence in some markets, where we do some things internally. And that's, I think, where we were able to, leverage those and then build on them, weave in, some of the digital components that weren't really considered in the old, sort of flow of how you develop packaging. So now we, much earlier in the process, start to think about, if we're going to do a photo shoot, how are we thinking about, the assets that might be useful in digital, social, etc. So that we don't just photograph for what's required on pack. And that's quite difficult to orchestrate in our world, because there might be different teams responsible for these different things. And there are also different timelines. So we might be doing packaging, months, if not, quite further upstream than, some of the more tactical activations, but rethinking how that can be woven together. Also thinking about at the end stage, when you've got your pack ready, how are you kind of going on these divergent paths of, either getting printed or then being developed into CGI, and product content, and looking at all of the other assets that both visual and textual, or even motion, that need to go on to our retailers. So that's what we call design to delivery now. It's now consistently rolled out. I think we have over 100 markets using both the process, and then we developed a digital workflow tool. And so, as I said, it's still a journey. There's still a lot to do on digital asset management and all that sort of stuff. But that has given us the aperture to see, what's working, what's not, in a way that we now have dashboards, so we can kind of see how many projects there are, how many, pack changes, et cetera, how many assets are being created out of that. And also looking at, the reuse, so what's the return on investment of one asset if we can see that it's being picked up again, by other markets. So,
amazing. I could just listen. There's so much there, but so there's two, as an extension to that, I suppose, two questions that students often ask. In fact, I still ask myself on the odd occasion in design and they are linked, and it links it is an extension to the explanation that you were providing there. Which one is, how do you know when you're concluding a design process? How do you know when you're getting to the point of that convergence, we think, and sometimes it's because you run out of time and money. But what is the process there? There's not a design environment I've worked in where that is the same. Usually it's dependent on a number of different factors. And secondly, as an extension to that, how do you evaluate success? How do you determine whether or not a product or re-envisaging of a product, a service, or product in this instance, I suppose, has been a success? What is the mechanism? Are there mechanisms you can use there?
Yeah. So let me tackle the first one, and also maybe look back to your previous question with regards to agencies, because that's still a fluid area, to be very honest. As I said, we have some internal studios, but we still mostly work with agencies. However, what D2D or design to delivery has allowed us to do is to really understand the roles and responsibilities of different agencies, so that we can tap into the right talent at the right time. Now, what that is still, and it's work in progress, but that is still not necessarily well understood, that maybe one agency is best suited for one part of the journey. Okay. And that there is a true end to that collaboration when maybe, a specialist in pre-press should get involved in really thinking about how to make a file print ready. So That I think is quite well established in many companies. At Nestle, it was really patchy. There were some markets that were a little bit more sophisticated on that maturity index, and others where they really didn't understand. I mean, they're still making some changes when they were on press. So we had to kind of institutionalize, like there's an end. There are stage gates. And for us, we have three critical ones when it comes to packaging. We apply this also for, some other design elements, not just packaging, but the design brief needs to be frozen, so at a certain stage, you got to make sure that anyone who's going to be exposed to the design later and has a voice in making a decision on whether or not to go or no go has to be aligned with the brief at the very beginning. And that's difficult, because some people just they would prefer to kind of work through the designs and then show their bosses. We're like, no, get your bosses involved at the beginning. Then we have what we call the design intent frozen. And that's also been a little bit difficult to explain what we mean by that. But that's, I think a reflection of how we work, which is that the global brands might not be executing, right? So they have to get to a stage where they are locking in the design intent. That design intent may include, some original visual assets, whether it be illustrations or photography, etc. But it is just an intent, because at a local level, they may have all kinds of different formats, etc. And so locking in that design intent allows that team to then go and codify what they mean by it. So what are some of those principles, and maybe some, hard rules or softer rules on how that can be then adapted. Then the adaptation phase happens, some production, and then, of course, artwork and pre-press. And then at the end of that, that's when we have the artwork frozen, and we can only go to print or get CGI created once that has taken place. So those are three core milestones that have incredibly helped us to make sure that we're not getting feedback at the wrong time, and conversely, that we're not involving, some stakeholders too early, involving, some people at the design intent stage, maybe, not so helpful. So anyway, so that's one thing that we've done in terms of, that, and then, the tool itself has actually helped us with that end, because it triggers you to think about, okay, I've sent the files to the printer, what comes next? So it needs to go into repositories. There needs to be some metadata, there needs to be some way that someone who needs to find that file later or use certain assets from it can easily find it. So we've sort of got a back end, that looks at that. And then in terms of success evaluation, couple things. I mean, I mentioned, the dashboard of, how are those assets used. That helps us from the perspective of reuse. We do spend time looking at that. But I will admit it is much harder, especially when it comes to packaging design, to measure the actual impact of whether or not that design has moved the needle. And we're still working on this, and I welcome any suggestions from the industry. I think it's sort of a black box, that many are trying to delve into. And frankly, the only time that we've been really, truly able to see this is when there's let's call it sometimes a screw up, or there is a missed opportunity with being able to launch a product with, usually what we do is we bundle, you launch a new product, or you launch a new innovation, and you've got some communication lined up, you've got some, whether it be digital or physical or advertising, and then, you might also do some promotions, and when you have that whole marketing mix together, it's super hard to figure out what was the impact of that packaging design, right? So the only time we've really been able to see that is when we haven't had any of that other stuff. And, the poor lonely package has gone to shelf. And for whatever reason, there's been no other support, there's been no other price index. And we've had some really lovely situations where we've seen huge uptick, so that's the true test, right? And that's what some of the smaller brands have too. They're only investing in packaging. They know how important packaging is to them. For us, we invest in so many other things in our marketing mix, it's really hard to extract the value down to the packaging design alone. And as I said, I'd be grateful, to learn a little bit more about that. We are investigating other metrics. We do research before we go to market with regards to, the purchase intent, but that's not the same as really knowing, how much did the design contribute to sales.
Absolutely. I had a he was now a professor when I was at art school. He used to talk about, for all we can furnish each other with design processes and models and tools and methods, there's no accounting for instinct and that sense of knowing what might be right in a particular domain. It's just something you can't teach. And I think that forms, alongside those other more quantifiable elements, has to be part of. Thank goodness for that. It'd be boring without that. So in terms, just moving into the last 10 minutes, folks, and we've got our little chat panel up here. For anybody, there's 29, 30 people on the call just now besides us. If you have any questions, pop them into the chat, and the last 5 minutes or so, I'll do my best to address those just before we finish. But what I'd like to get to now really is this role of design. So what is the role of design from your perspective? What is the future of that within Nestlé? And we talked beforehand around about going beyond the aesthetic. So, and what I mean by that is the problem-solving mechanism that design can be, its ability to simplify complexity, to bring people together, and to share between stakeholders the salient points that are part of a creative process, and hence the rise of the chief design officer across so many organizations now, but we're privileged enough to do so. Is that something you get, or is that me being wishing that into existence? Does that have a role in Nestlé? Can you see the evolution of design from a more vertical strand to something which is horizontally structured in Nestlé?
I would wholeheartedly welcome that. I think we have made great strides, but I look at some companies that have introduced, a chief design officer, and what I mean by that is like a true chief design officer that reports in directly to the CEO, or at least to very high up. I report into the global chief marketing officer. That's fantastic. I've got, a great lever of influence. I'm situated in a place where, at least from a marketing perspective, my team can speak with a lot of confidence that we're reaching, a big part of the Nestlé population. However, what we have to do is we have to collaborate and influence, with R&D, with IT, with HR, with lots of other parts of the organization who themselves may have design embedded within them, but we have to collaborate in a more informal way, and that's fine. We do it, and because we're I think designers are typically so curious, that we seek out other designers and we form these communities. But it's not the same as finance, chief financial officer, have finance teams in every department, and they can be those connectors and the translators, and pulling together and kind of seeing, a bird's eye view of what's happening in finance, around the organization. I think that those companies that are starting to do that in the area of design, I think have a great advantage. And I do see that has got to be the future, not just for Nestlé, but for all companies, because design is so important. And design, as I started to say, a little while ago, it is still ill-defined at Nestlé, and we're working on it. We're actively working on it. But I also encourage the industry in general, educational partners such as yourself, to help with this, because there is still, I think, too few people who come out with a design degree and know how to get into big companies. We need we need designers, but it might seem a little awkward to apply for a a marketing role, or an IT role, but and that's partly because not only us, but I suspect many other big companies don't don't easily know, they're a little awkward in this, how to write a job description where really it is about a design role.
Yeah, no,
Just doesn't say it
absolutely.
on the label.
Absolutely. I mean, we're still in this, regardless of I think which country you're from. If you're good at, and certainly in Scotland, we have a set of qualifications called hires, which are not quite A levels. They're not quite as hard as A levels, but they are the basis upon which you apply to university. And if you're very good at, it's still the case, but very good at the sciences, there is a suggestion that you should do something which is more science based as opposed to arts based. So the people that apply to art school usually are doing so because that's what they're very good at, as opposed to a choice that someone else has made who could have done a number of things. So in terms of, and as an extension to that, then, what advice would you give anyone who may be considering? Well, there's two aspects of this. I'm doubling these questions up. What advice would you give to someone who is considering a role in who's heard what you have to say today and is now perhaps considering a role in marketing and packaging that they wouldn't have done so before, but wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be good at art or an artist per se? So that's one aspect. And as an extension to that, I think what skills and aptitudes would you be looking for in someone when you're across the interview table from them at Nestle and they were applying for a role in your team, in your department? What attributes would you be looking for from them?
I think it depends where they are on their career trajectory, but I think with younger candidates, I'm looking for curiosity, ambition. I'm also looking for honesty, about what they want to learn, and frankly, with regards to the skill sets, I think that especially in large companies, there are roles that are more on the orchestration of design, where they may not need to be involved in the hands-on decision taking or directing of the design. And so some people who have gone to design school and maybe privately are very confident with their art, but when it comes to sort of more commercially focused art that just don't feel quite as comfortable, then there are plenty of opportunities for them to lend their design thinking and sort of design intuition and skill sets to other areas, which may be more about the how behind doing the design. Then I would say that those who like to be involved in actually the design creation, there are opportunities that may not necessarily seem very creative.
Yeah.
So they may seem like they're about guidelines or helping in a more of a support role. I would say jump on those, because going into a big company is it's like getting an MBA without getting an MBA.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's what you make of it, of course, but there are so many opportunities, to either participate in cross-functional projects where you can just learn by being part of the team, or there's all kinds of trainings, and lectures and all kinds of things that you can have access to. So even if it's just a short-term role, it can be super valuable in experience that you can glean above and beyond actually practicing the art of design.
Absolutely. It's almost an ideal way to gain an apprenticeship, isn't it? In a number of these different areas that have concentric areas of interest between them. Okay, Ximena, last question. We have 2 minutes left. Yes, let's call this the last question. In your role just now, there must be times, there's challenging times, clearly, and you've been very honest about what those are, and which has been really refreshing around about what the organisation doesn't do perhaps as well as it could. But in your role, there must be times you go, damn, I love this job. I really enjoy this. That worked. Give me an example of something, your day-to-day role, that you walk out the office or you're working from home, wherever you are, and you think, gosh, I'm glad I'm here. That gave me a sense of fulfillment. What would that mean to you? Give me an example of something that's done that to you recently in your role.
Hmm. Recently.
Or not necessarily recently.
Well, I was going to, the recently kind of did a pause because we haven't been in our office much.
Yeah.
So, but no, but honestly, actually, recently, the story I was mentioning about how we readdressed the packaging, the way that we organize information, what we call the backstory, you know, that was a really difficult project. It required a lot of collaboration with lots of, you know, regulatory compliance, legal, etc. You know, but at the end of the day, it is the springboard, you know, towards being able to use our packaging for storytelling in a different way. And so to have some of our senior leadership just spontaneously reference it when they're talking about the way that we are going to be communicating sustainability, you know, through the lens of our products was super. And I knew it. It was a confirmation that we had to brand it, the backstory, you know, but that's super rewarding to the team that worked on that, you know, because it was really difficult. I would say very quickly one that's a few years old now, but it links back to the five senses. I did one for a local brand called Perugina, which is an Italian chocolate brand. And we did the five senses. One thing I didn't mention about the five senses is we really truly tried to have a multisensory experience as part of it, and we did that with the maître chocolatier from the Perugina factory, who came and he explained everything about this amazing chocolate and the mass and how it's
already sounding good. This, whatever way this goes, it's already sounding good.
Exactly. We had to taste a lot, you know,
yeah,
mochi and etc. But anyway, so we did that, and that led to us not necessarily changing the logo very much, but we created the five senses, and it was super multisensorial. And we thought about what we needed to do to. It was pretty much a chaotic brand with like 500 different packages, etc. And when the business leader responsible for this brand came into the room after, you know, the 5 days that we were holed up together, imagining the future of the brand, and we showed, you know, we kind of did a cleaned up version of what the five senses would be. And he said, wow, I'm sitting here in Milan and you've taken me to the hills of Umbria in the spring and I smell the chocolate. And that was amazing. But what was even more amazing is that then the design team and the advertising team and the digital team and the shopper activation teams that went on to create what they next created, you wouldn't know that those were different teams, different agencies, because the whole thing is so cohesive and it comes from the heart, and they keep working on it, you know. So Perugina is sort of, it's one of those ones that I look back and, you know, they did a great job.
So that was a real integrity, wasn't it, in terms of the insight gathered right through to product development, execution, and I suppose recognition on behalf of the client. So that was a real end-to-end success, I suppose.
And frankly, it's because that team fell back in love with their products and their brand, and it shows.
Ximena, I've had a 2-minute warning way more than 2 minutes ago. So I'm going to draw this to a close. And one question popped up. I'm sorry, Graham, I've not had a chance to get to that yet. We're on a bit of a roll there. It just leaves me to say thank you so much, Ximena, for giving your time today. And that could have been 2 hours, and I'm sure we wouldn't have bottomed out all those really interesting points and stories you had there. Thank you so much on behalf of Expo North. And we must do this again next couple of years. You're very welcome.
With pleasure.
Great.
Thank you so much for the preparation, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Ximena.